Well, hello. My name's Dave, and I want to say thank you for joining us for our online service today. We are in week 2 of a series called Pressure Cooker. All right, and so here is why we're doing this series. If you missed last week, the stress of being inside most of the day during this season, right? The stress of maybe financial pressure you're going through, the stress of having to experience some uncertainty about the future, or maybe work out of the home when you're not accustomed to that, the stress of having kids around when they still have obligations to school, but the school has turned into some makeshift environment in your house, right? All of that stuff starts to add up. And then if you're on social media, it gets really complicated because you're looking at different TikTok videos that people are making and dances that people are coming up with, and you're looking at how people are enjoying their lives and family photos, and you're thinking like, is everybody on vacation right now? Is it just me that's experiencing stress? And so there's just a lot of different things right now that can contribute to an environment that makes us really, really, really feel unhealthy. Physically unhealthy, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, relationally unhealthy. And so that's why we're doing this series. And that's why we're talking about the pressure cooker of life. And specifically today, I want to talk about the pressure cooker of marriage. But before I do, I'm going to put it away. So here's the deal. In a normal season, marriage can be very challenging. Right? But in the current season, in the current environment, it can actually be overwhelming because in the current environment, with all the different pressures that we're facing, what happens is little irritations, like someone chewing their food a little too loudly, or maybe somebody not putting their shoes exactly where they're supposed to be. Those irritations can be interpreted as major character flaws in our spouse. And then what happens is things that simply used to annoy us now turn into anger, they turn into resentment, maybe blame and finger pointing. And I'm convinced if we stay sheltered in place for too long, it's gonna end up in murder at some level, right? Chris Rock, the great theologian, he says, if you haven't contemplated murder, you ain't been in love. He says, if you've never stood in front of a mirror practicing your alibi, you ain't been in love. And I know that you have experienced some of those emotions from time to time. So, in the late 1800s, there was a guy by the name of Joseph Richardson in New York City. He owned a worthless piece of land. It was 5 feet wide. It was 100 feet long. And so naturally, he just tried to sell it off. He talked to his neighbor who had an adjoining property, had some apartments on there. And they said, yeah, we'll buy it. But then they lowballed him. He was expecting right around $5,000 for the property. They offered him $1,000 for the property. And he got offended. And so he decided he was going to make a point. And what he did is he ended up building a house on that small property, a house that was 5 feet wide and 100 feet long. And he blocked the view of the apartments. And if that wasn't enough, in order to really make his point, because he wanted to see the misery he was putting them in, he moves into the house. This is where he lives for the rest of his life, multi-millionaire, and he's living in a very, very tiny house, 5 feet wide, 100 feet long, and he's just doing it to tick people off. And so naturally, it became known as the Spite House. Now, this actually surprises me, but there are plenty of spite houses in the United States. There's lots of different homes that have been built to spite neighbors, to tick them off, to make a point, to prove something, to irritate people, to get their blood boiling. And I've always been fascinated by spite houses. And I think the reason they fascinate me is because they're such a great metaphor for what real life is and what marriage can be, right? When in marriage, we think, well, I've got to prove my point and do whatever necessary is necessary to prove my point, or I'm going to do whatever I can to get my own way, or I've got to have the last word, or try to one up the other person. What happens in the end is often we're the ones who end up living in the miserable house that we constructed. We're the ones who are inconvenienced. And so in this season, with COVID-19 and all the different complications that have come about, here's what I know. It's very easy to build a spite house in our own home. And so what I want to do today is I just want to be proactive. I just want to pause. I want to take a deep breath, right? And I want to ask ourselves this question. Why did we get married in the first place? Why did we get married in the first place? almost every wedding that I officiate, I meet with the couple a few weeks, sometimes a few months ahead of time, and I ask this question: why are we here? Like, what's your story? Tell me about your journey thus far. What is it about each other that has drawn you together and attracted you? I mean, billions of people on this planet, and you've chosen this person to get married to. Why? And as you can imagine, all the answers are pretty similar. Oh, I just love him. Oh, I adore her. Oh man, I've never felt this way about another person before. Oh, when we get together, it's hard to explain, Dave, but we bring out the best in one another. And those are great answers. But did you know it's totally possible to love someone and not be married to them? I mean, this is true. You can live with someone. You can have sex with someone. You can combine finances. You can have kids together. You can go on dates. You can do all sorts of things and not be married to someone. So let me ask it again. Why did you get married in the first place? Right, looking back for me, 20 some years, why did Randy and I choose to shackle ourselves to each other for the rest of our lives? Is it because we didn't like freedom? Is it because we didn't like the independence of being single? Right, for you, is it because you wanted tax benefits? If you're in a blended family, is it because you were really hoping that you could be in a relationship with someone who would give you unsolicited advice on how to parent your kids that you brought into the relationship? Is that why you're married? Is it to have a beautiful piece of paper that you can hang on the wall and prove to the world that you are in a relationship? Well, of course not. Most of us who've chosen to be married did it because we really, really, really believed in the core of our being that there is power in commitment. There is power in commitment. Now, if you're in a long-term relationship or for whatever reason you're in a relationship and you're not married, do not send me emails, all right? I'm not here to bash you or make fun of you. I'm not here to challenge you. But the reality is that most people who choose to get married do it because they understand the power of commitment. As humans, we behave very differently when we commit to something. This is why when you take out a loan from a bank, right? You get a mortgage on your house. This is why the bank doesn't just allow you to say, hey, it's my desire, it's intention, I'm gonna pay you back. They don't take your word. They make you sign legal documents. This is why if you ever decide to join the military, you don't just show up one day and say, I'm in, I'm giving you my word. No, because if you just gave me a word, I promise you a couple days into boot camp, most people would be gone. So if you're gonna join the military, they make you sit down, they make you sign a contract. You gotta give years of your life in most cases to being a part of the military. If you join a team, you've gotta commit to practicing with that team and being a part of that team. Often you have to sign something, right? If you work at Great Lakes Church, we have you sign something. We have you sign and agree to certain things that we believe and agree to certain types of behavior. It's just, there's power in making commitments. And this is why at some point in every marriage ceremony, I look to the groom and I say those powerful words, marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today. No, I don't say that. I say, listen, man, do you take this lovely lady to be your wedded wife, to live together in marriage? Do you promise to love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, and forsaking all others, be faithful only to her for as long as you both shall live? If so, say, I do. And he says, I do. And then often the couple has either written personal vows to exchange each other, or they have traditional vows that they exchange for better, for worse, richer, for poorer, sickness and health, right? But they make commitments to each other. Now, what's fascinating about the commitments that we make during a wedding ceremony is that we're not just committing to marry the person who's standing there in front of us that we know or we think we know. Right? We're actually committing to marry the person that they become over time. And in every talk that I give on marriage, I say this because it's so important. Over time, everybody changes. Our bodies change. Our minds change, our beliefs change, our friendships change, what our family looks like changes, our personalities often change, right? Because as we go through life and we go through ups and downs and we experience tragedy and we experience good events in our life and all of those things, including the transitions we go through, all of those things shape us in some way. They change us in some way. And so I know we don't think about it when we exchange vows, but every few years we are married to a different person. And so here's my question. How do you keep your commitment to love, comfort, and honor the other person when they're constantly evolving and constantly changing, especially if they're evolving into someone that you don't really like? How do you persevere when the pressure cooker of life is really heating up? Is it working on your communication skills? Is it showing respect? Is it spending quality time with each other? Is it learning to forgive? Is it showing kindness and compassion? Is it acts of service? Like, what is it? And the answer is yes. Yes, 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 yes. It's all of those things, but it's more than those things. All of those things that we would say, this is what it takes to have a great marriage and a healthy marriage. This is what it takes to go the distance. All of those things are rooted in a little word called humility. Humility. If you want for your relationship to go the distance, if you want to be more than just roommates who coexist and cohabitate, it's going to require humility. And I love how the great author C.S. Lewis defines humility. He says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So humility isn't self-deprecation. It's not being critical of myself or downplaying my accomplishments. Humility is this ability to take the spotlight off myself and shine it onto another person. Humility is the ability to honor someone else. Humility is saying, I'm not going through life entitled. I don't have to have my way every single time. And so relationships that go the distance are relationships that are fueled by humility. And the good news for all of us is that humility is a choice. Humility is not something you're born with. Humility is something you choose. And so one day, Jesus is teaching his disciples and he's explaining to them what it takes to be great. And what he does is he actually points out a group of people that everybody thinks is really great. And he says, you see these people, everybody likes to honor them. Everybody thinks that they're worth admiring. And then he says this to them. He says, the greatest among you must be a servant. So you want to know what greatness looks like? It looks like serving. He says, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Those who humble themselves. Humility is a choice. Every time that you choose to stop talking and you choose to actively listen to your spouse instead of trying to dominate the conversation, what happens is you're growing in humility. Every time that you choose to thank your spouse for something you take for granted, you're growing in humility. Every time that you embrace the differences between you and your spouse, rather than criticizing those differences, you're growing in humility. Every time you choose to speak highly of your spouse in front of your kids or to other people, you're growing in humility. Every time you choose to give full attention to your spouse when they're talking, and you're not being distracted by all these different electronics around you, you're growing in humility. And so the Apostle Paul, he writes a letter in the first century to followers of Jesus living in Philippi, and he's writing in the context of relationships. And here's what he writes. Don't be selfish. Now, do you want to know why he writes this? It's because he understands human nature. He knows there's something in all of us that primarily thinks about ourselves. And so he writes, don't be selfish. And then he continues. He says, don't try to impress others. Life is not a competition. More importantly, marriage is not a competition. In marriage, you are on the same team. So when one of you loses, both of you lose. So in my case, it's Team Nelson. Others of you, you're on Team Johnson. You're on Team Jenkins. You're on Team Jefferson. But in marriage, you are a team. It is not a competition. Some of you might remember this years and years ago. Back in 1994, this is when the Chicago Bulls were on top of the world, but Michael Jordan was already off the team. The Bulls were up against the Knicks in Game 3 of the semifinals. The big dog player on the team, right? The celebrity of celebrities was Scottie Pippen. He was the man. In fact, over the past few weeks, this story has been highlighted in one of the final episodes of the documentary that every sports fan has been drooling over, The Last Dance. And it just kind of triggered my mind in this, that here's Scottie. He's a superstar. And with 1.8 seconds to go in the game against the Knicks, the score's tied. Bulls are in possession of the ball. And so Coach Jackson calls a timeout and he determines the next play. Well, when the team goes back on the court, Scottie's not with them. And everybody's wondering, what's happening? Where is Scottie? Well, apparently what happened is a play that was initially designed with Scottie in mind. Coach Jackson decided to go with that play, But instead of using Scottie Pippen for the play, he decided to go with Tony Kukoc. And Scottie threw a temper tantrum. He threw a fit. He just sat down and decided he wasn't going to play. And so they go out, and sure enough, Tony makes the winning, scores the winning basket, and everybody celebrates. And after the game, Scottie Pippen did admit, he said, hey, coach made the right call. I can criticize Scottie all day long for being a big baby, but here's the reality. I do this all the time in my own marriage. Right? When I don't get my way, I just pout, and I know that it's very easy for you to do the same. So the Apostle Paul writes these words. He don't be selfish, right? And don't try to impress others. And then he goes on and he says this, be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Now, this is huge. In our relationships, and specifically in the context of what we're talking, romantic relationships, Paul says, I want you to think of your partner. I want you to treat your partner as though they are better and more important than you are. Of course, our pushback is, hold on, wait a minute. He's my husband. She's my wife. They're my fiance. They don't have greater intrinsic value than me, right? We are equal in the sight of God. I got to tell you, that's true. And that attitude that, hey, we're going to just be perfectly equal in everything, I'm going to tell you, that works great if you're a roommate. That works great if you want a contract business relationship or you just want to be best friends. But if you want to develop a relationship that goes the distance, if you want to become one with the other person and want to reflect the kind of love that God has for us in your relationship, then you have to make a decision. And the decision isn't, are they better and are they more important than I am? The decision is, will I treat them as though they are better and more important than I am? See, humble people treat the other person with importance. Now, here's the deal. This is something we all know how to do because we've all been in environments when we knew we were not the most important person in the room. Maybe you were in a meeting and the CEO was in the room. You knew they were the most important person. Or if you've ever been to a wedding and you were not the bride, you were not the most important person because when you showed up, nobody stood. But when the bride came in the room, everybody stood. Right? If you've ever been into a hospital room right after a mom gives birth to a brand new child, right? You're not the most important person. It's the mom, it's the child that gets all the attention. And so the question is, how do you act when you're around someone who's more important than you are? Now, this isn't a trick question, right? You know how to act. I know how to interact. You don't interrupt. You listen intently. You don't correct stories. You don't do things to make them feel stupid. You laugh at their jokes, even when their jokes aren't funny, right? You know what to do when you're in a room and someone is more important than you. In a conversation, you defer to them. Can you imagine what it would do for our marriages? Can you imagine what it would do for our relationships if we learned how to defer to the other person more? If we learned how to listen more? If we let them make more decisions? If we valued their opinion more? If we made them feel more important? Can you just imagine what would happen? So Paul says, as he writes this letter, be humble, thinking of others is better than yourselves. And then he continues. He says, don't look out only for your own interest, but take an interest in others too. Paul says, look for ways to be interested in the other person. Now, do you know why this is so hard? It's because I'm interested in the things that interest me. And I'm not interested in the things that aren't of interest to me because they aren't interesting to me. What interests me is documentaries. What interests me is hunting. What interests me is hanging out with friends around a fire pit. That's what interests me. But if it doesn't fit into my category of interest, it's hard for me to get engaged. Here's the deal though. Humble people take an interest in what the other person is interested in. Now remember, this is a choice. I can choose to take an interest in the things that interest Rindy. So this week I asked Rindy, I said, Rindy, what is something I do that maybe annoys you? And it took her about 0.3 seconds to answer. She said, well, one of the things that really annoys me is when we're going to watch a movie together and then you're on your phone the whole time or you're on your computer while we're watching the movie the whole time. Now, I could give you a good reason that I do that. It's because the movies that Rindy typically likes are not of interest to me, right? We have very different styles in movies. But I didn't realize that that actually hurt her. I didn't realize that that was offensive to her. Humble people take an interest in what the other person is interested in. Another thing about humble people is they're realistic about their own faults, weaknesses, and limitations. Nothing is more annoying than being around someone who presents every idea and every opinion and every thought of theirs as though they are the Messiah to this planet. As though they know how to fix everything, how they know how to right every wrong, how they just can do everything they do is right, and whatever anybody else does is wrong. So in another letter, the Apostle Paul writes in the first century, he says this to his readers. He says, don't think you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves. Now again, this doesn't mean I have to be self-critical. This doesn't mean I have to be self-deprecating, but it does mean I have to be aware of my faults and weaknesses and limitations. And one of the greatest signs of a healthy couple is that both individuals are very, very aware of their faults, and they're so aware of their faults that neither of them have to wait to be caught or confronted by an issue in order to deal with it. In other words, when they fall short, when they drop the ball, when they do something they shouldn't do, they quickly recognize it, they acknowledge it, and they proactively bring it up so that it doesn't get in the way of love. Humble people commit to taking the first step. So a humble person who realizes when they screw up is going to say, honey, here's the deal. I overspent. I spent more money than we've agreed on that I should spend by myself, because there should be at least some limit for all of us, right? And so I screwed up, and let's deal with it. Or honey, here's the deal. I was thinking about how I talked to you earlier, and I was wrong. I overreacted. I'm sorry. It's my fault. Humble people own up to things. They're realistic about their faults, their weaknesses, and their limitations. Another thing about humble people is they recognize the need or their need for the other person. Now, let me be clear. We do not need another person to complete us or make us whole. But humble people are able to see and appreciate the value someone else brings into their life. And so one of the most powerful ways to affirm our spouse is just to acknowledge to them that we need them. How often do you verbalize that to the person you're in a relationship with? I'm not just saying you tell them you love them. No, but you express that you need them. Because here's the deal. Every handwritten note, every card, every voicemail, every email has the potential to communicate to your spouse, I need you in my life. There is one term that I absolutely despise, almost above every other term, and it is the term self-made. And the reason why is I'm convinced there's nobody self-made. You're not a self-made millionaire. You're not a self-made billionaire. You didn't do anything by yourself. Everything we've done in life has required other people to get us there. And the same is true in marriage. Another thing about humble people, they have the ability to convey hurt without retaliating. So if you want a marriage that goes a distance, then you need to learn how to convey hurt without retaliating against the person and paying them back for what they did to you. So the most helpful way that I personally have found to do this is I have learned over time to identify my emotions and then name what I'm feeling. So when you get really defensive or you find yourself feeling hurt, my question to you is, what specific emotion did your spouse, did your partner, did your fiance surface in you? You know, the easy answer is, well, they made me angry. They made me so angry. And I get that. And sometimes the right emotion is anger, but often it's different than that. Often it's, if you really thought about it, well, I felt left out. I was embarrassed. I felt unappreciated. And so we need to pay attention to our emotions. And since most of us are really bad at that, I encourage you to Google something. Google the words wheel of emotion or wheel of emotions. And there should be an emotion that looks like the one you see on your screen right now. And I would encourage you, go ahead and print it off. And when you start feeling yourself get irritated, you start feeling yourself get annoyed, find the emotion that you can most identify with. Because if we don't learn to identify our emotions, what happens is they stay buried. And even though they're buried, they're driving our life. They're driving what we say. They're driving what we don't say. They're driving what we do and what we don't do. But if we can unearth them and we can name them, they start to lose power. And so one of the healthiest ways to communicate with our partner is this phrase, when you blank, I feel blank. When you say this, I feel this way. When you do that, I feel this way. When you wear no clothes, whatever it is for you, you've got to be able to finish the phrase, right? Humble people convey hurt without retaliating. So let's learn to humble ourselves, because humility is the foundation for a healthy marriage. Now, let me close with this. Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus, decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus, he writes about humility in one of his letters. And here's what he says to his readers. He says, all of you, dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. And then he spends the next couple of verses actually talking about how important it is to humble ourselves. And as he starts to wrap up his thoughts on humbling ourselves, he throws this in there for good measure. He says, give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. When your marriage starts to feel like a pressure cooker, and you're stressed and you're overwhelmed and you don't know how much longer you can continue in the relationship, Peter says, before you lash out at the other person, before you say something to the other person you're going to regret, before you do something that you wish you could take back, I want you to humble yourself. And I want you to take your issues and your struggles and your frustration and your stresses to your heavenly Father. And I want you to learn how to cast your worries and cares on him. I want you to learn how to pray raw and honest prayers and learn how to express yourself to your heavenly Father. Now, the reason I'm closing with this today, and the reason I find it so fascinating, is because this phrase that Peter uses, cast your worries, cast your cares upon God, is not something that he just came up with. It's actually something he borrows from a prayer that King David of Israel prayed 1,000+ years earlier. King David was going through a time in his life where he had experienced deep betrayal by a very close friend. It was destroying him emotionally. It was obviously destroying him relationally. And so King David, in order to deal with what's in his heart, he sits down and he writes out a prayer that expresses how he's feeling. I'm going to read some of the prayer to you. Here he goes. He says, listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my cry for help. Please listen and answer me, for I am overwhelmed by my troubles. A little bit later, he writes, everything is falling apart. Have you ever felt like that in your relationship, in your marriage? Doesn't matter what you do, it's not good enough. Everything that you're working so hard to build, the other person seems to kind of be a bystander and it just feels like it's going nowhere. This is where King David's at. And then he says this, it's not an enemy who taunts me. I could bear that. It's not my foes who so arrogantly insult me. I could have hidden from them. But this isn't about an enemy. He says, instead, it is you, my equal, my companion and close friend. Have you ever felt that way about your husband or wife? Like this person that I love so deeply that I've committed to be with in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. They're the ones against me. They're the ones who are making this so difficult on me. And then he reflects at the times that he used to have with this person. He says, what good fellowship we once enjoyed as we walked together to the house of God. You know, if you're married, it's easy to look back over the years and say, man, I remember that vacation. I remember when we fell in love and all the times we had laughed together. I remember this date night and that date night. But now David's at a point where he says this friend has turned into an enemy. And it's obvious there's so much hurt. He says, let death stalk my enemies. Let the grave swallow them alive, for evil makes its home within them. The English equivalent to what he is saying is to hell with them. You ever felt that way about the person you're married to? And then David quickly refocuses himself. He says, but I will call on God and the Lord will rescue me morning, noon, and night. I cry out in my distress and the Lord hears my voice. He said, this is so emotional. This is so overwhelming that I just pray and pray and pray. And I'm trying to bring God into this situation. He says, as for my companion, he betrayed his friends. He broke his promises. As for my husband, as for my wife, they have hurt me in a significant way. And here's David. He doesn't know what to do. And then he writes this, give your burdens to the Lord and he will take care of you. It's almost as if he reminds himself, listen, I can carry this for the rest of my life. I can let it affect every word I say. I can affect my actions, or I can find a way to just try to deal with this between me and God. And what's so interesting about this prayer is that obviously King David writes it after a betrayal, after deep hurt by a close friend. But here we are more than 1,000 years later when Peter's writing it. And there's no doubt he's sitting down and he's reflecting on his time with Jesus. He's heard the teachings of Jesus. He's seen the miracles of Jesus. But he remembers he betrayed Jesus. And so he says to his readers in the context of relationship, he says, all of you, dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. Give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. When you experience deep hurt and disappointment and betrayal and frustration and annoyance in your relationship, Can I encourage you, before you lash out at that person, before you say something or do something you regret, find a way to lash out at God. Because first of all, God can take it. But if we start with God, my guess is that God will start to change our heart. My guess is it will help us take steps in humbling ourselves. And it will keep us from building a spite house in our own home. Let me pray for you. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for relationships, specifically today in the context of what we're talking about. We thank you for marriage relationships. And so what we pray today is that you would give us the wisdom to know how to take the steps we need to humble ourselves, and then give us the courage to do it. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of the week.